My name is Risa Shimoda with the River Management Society, and we're thrilled to have you here to listen to Lisa Ronald, who works with she's Associate Conservation Director for American Rivers on a really interesting topic. I think you'll find it very thought-provoking and difficult, and really interesting. How can timber harvest and river protections be compatible? So thank you, Lisa, for being here, and take it away.
Super. Well, thanks folks for the opportunity to engage with you. I work with American Rivers. My home and the region in which I work is the sort of northwestern Montana and central and northern Idaho. These are obviously the sovereign lands and of a variety of different tribes. Where I live in Missoula, Montana, are the ancestral homelands of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And this is an interesting question that my organization, American Rivers, has been looking into. And so before I get into describing some research and a report that we are looking at generating this coming year, I want to set some context as to, why is American Rivers interested in this question? And why might this particular question be relevant and interesting and important to you and the work that you do? There are a variety of political and social forces that are different in our world right now. And I doubt this is news to many of you, but I'm going to bring some of these together in a way that hopefully helps you understand some of the background behind this question. So the Trump administration released the Timber Production Executive Order in March. About a month later, the Forest Service announced a 25% increase in timber production across the National Forest System. I was just at a conference this week, actually in Missoula, hosted by the Intertribal Timber Symposium. And some of the predictions from economists are predicting that a lot of that timber will come from regions 8, regions 5 and 6, with some also from regions 1 through 4. So obviously not necessarily an equitable distribution of how that 25% increase in timber production across the National Forest System is going to be divided up. And then we have tariffs. Some predict that the tariffs could be as high as 39%. Again, that's a changing landscape in the news right now. But if that is true, and tariffs on particularly lumber and lumber resources from Canada exceed about 20%, that's not a scenario that economists have run before. And so that puts us into very new territory as to what impacts those tariffs may have on things like housing, and thus the demand for a variety of different natural resources that contribute to housing. We're also seeing efforts to deregulate a variety of processes that are applicable to public lands. Again, this is probably not news to many of you. There are going to be some changes to the way that NEPA works. There may be additional harvesting that happens under Good Neighbor Authority and other types of authorities. There may be additional categorical exclusions that may accelerate timber harvest and will make changes in the way that timber harvest works on Forest Service lands. There's also additional focus on fire mitigation through not only legislation but other things. So we have, for example, the Fix Our Forests Act in Congress right now is a focus of Congress, and so there's new legislation coming down the pipe that may make changes in how timber is harvested in context of fire on public lands. And finally, we have reductions in workforce, which will affect the degree to which agencies can be responsive to the demands of these executive orders, as well as other things that are coming down from Washington. And so that may, for example, bring in more and different partners in different ways that are conducting timber and timber related activities on public lands. And then switching to social forces, housing markets right now are very strong. There's a continuing housing shortage across much of the country that is particularly profound in the West, where I live and where many of you live as well. And 50% of lumber actually goes to new housing starts. So there is a direct correlation between the acceleration of timber production and housing, and particularly new houses. And then lastly, something I think that American Rivers has observed in some of our interactions with different agencies at different levels is that there are perceptions about the incompatibility of river protections and a variety of different forest management activities, particularly as they relate to fire mitigation and restoration. So if you sort of lump all of these things together, the background in which American Rivers wanted to ask the question, where have we had compatibility between two different types of forces, between river protection and then forest management activities taking place on public lands, particularly in river corridors? Because we know that when we don't do timber and timber related activities well, we can have significant reductions over time in the quality, consistency, and extent of river protections. And not just specific to wild and scenic rivers, for example. That's what I'm going to focus on for the report and the research that we're doing. But there are a host of other authorities and tools that the Forest Service and other agencies use to protect rivers and watersheds that may be impacted or their efficacy decreased when we have poorly conducted timber activities in relation to those watersheds. So some of these types of impacts can be things like increased road networks, and road networks specifically that are above or near or upstream of rivers, of wild and scenic rivers. Here are some just additional pictures of increased road network and some of the things like erosion and sedimentation, road sloughing that can happen to associated infrastructure that's put in place to facilitate logging, timber, and fire, anything timber related, regardless of the goals. And so again, this sort of has led American Rivers to try to think through, well, where on the landscape have we had this compatibility between activities that involve timber harvest and specifically wild and scenic rivers? And we're conducting a pilot research project on the Flathead Wild and Scenic River, which is north of where I work in Missoula, Montana. And we're exploring this concept there as a way to try to reveal case studies and best practices from the past where we may have already done this, we may have already achieved this type of compatibility, and we can bring that information and that knowledge forward into how we make decisions now in a landscape where we have increased focus on timber and timber extraction. So this is the area that we're talking about. So for those of you who are not familiar with Montana, this is Montana. The Flathead National Forest and the Flathead Wild and Scenic River are located in northwestern Montana, very near to Glacier National Park. The river itself is about 220 miles long. And it was designated as wild and scenic in 1976. It has 3 different forks. So the North Fork that you see here, the northernmost fork, flows from Canada south to meet up with the Middle Fork and the South Fork. The Middle Fork and the South Fork both flow from within the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and they both flow sort of northwest. The Middle Fork and the North Fork form the parts of the southern and western boundary of Glacier National Park. So the North Fork in particular flows along that eastern or that western edge of Glacier National Park. But all of these segments have different categorizations. So they have sections of the segments that are categorized in different ways: wild, scenic, or recreational. And so that's why you see 3 different colors of blue here. The lightest color of blue is your recreationally categorized wild and scenic river segment. The lighter or the mid blue, which is on the North Fork, is your scenic. And then the dark blue is your wild categorized section. So this area is pretty special, and it has a long history. Historically, it is the birthplace of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act through the Craighead brothers, who have sort of a long history in Montana. This particular river system is recognized for its extremely high water quality. This picture is from the South Fork. The South Fork is one of the last places where visitors can legally fish for bull trout. This is the wild section of the Middle Fork, which provides some incredibly remote wilderness paddling adventures. It's also the location of the never-built Spruce Park Dam, which was the genesis of thinking around how we protect rivers in a more deliberate and expansive way in our country, back in the 50s and 60s, and then ultimately with the passage of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. But the Flathead also has a lot of visitation. So it has very wild sections. And then in contrast to that, it has highly visited sections. So these, the recreational and the scenic sections, in particular, as you get close to Columbia Falls and close to Glacier National Park. So visitation on the river has steadily grown, particularly over the last 5 years. There's been a large jump in visitor numbers in the wake of COVID-19, as well as kind of during that same time period, the launch of Glacier National Park's limited entry permit system. So once the park fills up, then a lot of visitation that would have gone to Glacier National Park gets funneled thus onto the different river segments that are close to Columbia Falls. Flathead County is also one of the fastest growing counties in the state. So it has a 2% increase in growth. And when you again sort of look more nationally at housing starts and how the demand for housing and the increase in housing and in housing starts in particular is coupled with demand for lumber, you can see that this area in Montana may also see an increase in development and thus demand for construction related materials. The portions of this river segment that our research is focusing on is looking at 2 segments of the recreational parts of 2 different forks. So the recreational segment of the North Fork and the recreational segment of the South Fork. So the recreational segment of the North Fork is just above and sort of flowing down to the city of Columbia Falls. The recreational section of the South Fork comes out of the wilderness and ends right at, or kind of at the end of, Hungry Horse Reservoir, which is sort of the fatter blue part that you see north of the recreational segment that's circled. And although we know through the Forest Service handbook that the Forest Service has a lot of latitude in what activities occur in wild and scenic river corridors. Here's just kind of a quote and some summary of the different types of activities. I think we still see some challenges in this notion of whether or not we can have compatibility between forest management activities and river protections. And so what I'm going to play for you now, and I'll just kind of talk through this as you're watching it. What you're watching is a kind of a flip book. If you were to go back in time and you were to graph all of the different types of activities that have happened in this segment on the North Fork, so one of the recreational segment on the North Fork, and then you sort of played that over time as a flip book, this is what you would see. So this is a time-lapse video based on the GIS data from the Forest Service, all of the Forest Service's project GIS data of all of the different types of projects that have occurred since 1976 in this river corridor and where they have occurred. And obviously just grossly categorizing them into four very broad categories: cutting, burning, the removal of invasives, and planting. And when you overlay all of these together, you see something like this. So this is the same river corridor. It's expanded out a little bit. This is your North Fork. And you can see there's a lot of polygons sort of layered on top of one another at different time periods, which makes the video illustrative in a different way, sort of showing a different view of this same data. But I think what's interesting to see here, just strictly from the GIS data, both on this recreational North Fork segment and on this recreational South Fork segment, is that most of the river corridor has been subject to some level of forest management activity over the course of almost 50 years. Right. So we have a long history on the Flathead of a lot of different types of management that have taken place in this river corridor. And so I think as we're looking at the different types of projects and we're looking, sort of more in depth at this data, we want to understand sort of the two sides of this compatibility question. And so this is where I'd love for folks to chime in the chat. So I'd like folks to think about what do you think makes a project conducted within a wild and scenic river corridor successful? And if you have some ideas there, I'd love for you to throw them into the chat right now. So yeah, Will's keying in on the impacts to ORVs, or in this case, lack of impact to ORVs and to water quality. And that's a good observation, Andy. When wild and scenic rivers flow through wilderness, there are obviously added metrics there that are specific to wilderness. Where they do not flow through wilderness, however, wilderness character is not something that is specific to wild and scenic river management. Becca's keying in on scenic integrity. Great. So a lot of really good thoughts here from folks keying in on things like making sure that we're not having impacts to the outstandingly remarkable values, that projects are long lasting, that there are low or no impacts to water quality, etc. No impacts to free flow. That's another piece of this. So some really good thoughts from folks on what makes a project successful in a protected river corridor. But now I'm interested, similarly, let's take a look at the other side of this coin, and would love for folks to chime in. Similarly, so if you look at a project conducted through like a forest management lens or different lens, what makes a project involving timber harvest successful? So I find this other side of the coin is still a little fuzzy for us as we're exploring this topic. But would love to hear some thoughts from y'all on, if you look through a timber harvest lens, what makes a project that involves timber harvest of some type, what makes that project successful? So Karita, you have a great thought there. Long-term plan for revegetation. That's good. Kai, I think there are a lot of different forest management goals that are often associated with projects. So meeting those goals, managing disease, positive economic impact to rural communities, meeting timber targets, safety is a great one, visual and ecological standards. So yeah, so there definitely are some other things that are success metrics when we look at projects instead of through a wild and scenic river lens, but through a timber lens. And so these are some of the sort of, I'm going to call them quote success criteria that we're working with, and discussions like this help us to add bullets to these lists. So things like, I think one thing is like, did the project actually happen? Did it occur? Is perhaps a success metric that we're taking for granted a little bit. Again, looking at those ORVs, were there aspects of the project that were actually changed to maintain or enhance ORVs in the analysis? Was there litigation that occurred that changed the project in some way, or that prevented it from happening? I think on that forest management side, y'all keyed in on some of these things. Were the overarching goals of the project met? Are there, is there an extent of timber harvest, an intensity of harvest? The sale pieces, the economic pieces, was there a sale? Was there a timber target? Is there a cost and profitability piece of this? So I think these are all questions that we're looking at to determine, where is that shared space where you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have all of these things, all of these questions answered, and answered positively on the same set of ground. And so talking a little bit more just about the specifics of the research that we're doing on the Flathead Wild and Scenic River. So thus far, we have looked at 16 different projects that have publicly accessible NEPA records. These projects occur or occurred between 1976 and the present on the Flathead Wild and Scenic River, either in the recreational or the scenic sections. They also occurred between 2009 and the present on 6 eligible wild and scenic rivers on the forest. We're targeting a handful of projects for possible case studies. And so I've listed those tentative projects here, and I've also listed some of the project's goals associated with those projects. So you can see that projects that took place in both designated and eligible wild and scenic river corridors had a variety of different success metrics associated with the overall project, a small portion of which obviously happened in the wild and scenic river corridor. A lot of these are related to fuel reduction, forest health. You also see some forest product goals associated with one of these projects, as well as some aquatics metrics. And then in addition to inspecting these 4 projects more heavily for the possibility of case studies, we're looking at a longitudinal analysis that would be limited to the South Fork, that South Fork recreational section. So looking at one geography across time. So sort of looking at 4 projects that happen on a big geography at, certain points in time, and then looking longitudinally at one geography and what took place within that select geography over the course of time as a way to try to mine these case studies. So this is the geography that we're looking longitudinally at. to, better, to analyze sort of all of the different projects that have happened in this one section of river corridor. If you plot, for example, the projects that you saw in this map. So this is basically, here's the map of the projects. Here's a bar graph by acreage and year of the types of activities that happened, when they happened, across 7 different projects and more than 4,000 acres. So these are sort of, this is that longitudinal look within that select geography on the South Fork of the Flathead. And although, again, we're just kind of starting this piece of analysis and starting to look into this geography and these different projects in more detail, it is interesting when you look across time at like what types of stuff happened and when they happened, when we're looking all the way back to the 80s, between the 80s and now. So in this particular section, you see an initial focus on a lot of planting. You see something interesting happened in 1991. Something also socially interesting happened, for example, in 1999. And there's a story behind those years, behind why we see those spikes in the different types of activities. We don't know what those are at this point. But you see that there's a focus initially on cutting and burning that moves into a focus on a heavy focus on the removal of invasives in the last probably 10 years or so within the river corridor. So again, I think there are some stories to be told behind this data. We don't know entirely what those are yet, but that's I think the reasoning behind this project is to really get at those success stories and the stories behind these numbers. So lastly, I just want to share a little bit more about our timeline and sort of what this looks like. We have some meetings that we are scheduling or hoping to schedule with retired and current Forest Service staff on the Flathead National Forest, again, to just better understand what those success criteria are, what some of the nuances are behind the project history in this area. We need to further analyze those case studies. So looking much more closely at the NEPA record on the chosen projects and trying to ferret out some of the stories behind those. We'll look at some site visits in later this summer to look at what do things look like now on the ground. When we have a better idea of like what the history is, what are the different activities that have happened in one particular place. What is the cumulative of that look like now after a lot of time has gone by? And then we're looking to publish this report later this fall or early winter 2026, and then conducting meetings with interested parties. So we're hopeful that we'll have some interest in this report as a discussion starter with different agencies, with different communities, with timber companies, for example, a lot of different stakeholders in this place that I think are very interested in this research. So I think lastly, I don't think this research is going to be the end all be all, and it's going to entirely, totally clarify this very gray question. But I think our hope and our desire going into this is that we need to show where we have been successful at achieving compatibility between river protection and forest management. If we're wanting to change the culture around perceptions of compatibility in a social and political environment where we have an increased focus on extractive industry. And so I think this is a cultural shift that we hope this information and this research may be able to shed some light on and to be the starter of change. So with that, I have a few minutes left. Be happy to answer any questions y'all have. I think there may be also an opportunity here that would be helpful dialogue for the group. If any of y'all, excuse me, have had either challenges or successes with projects in your river corridors. Obviously, this is talking about the Flathead, but certainly recognizing that, you know, this is one place in one piece of the country. No, it's certainly not the only place where there has been successful compatibility. So if you have either a success story or a story of challenge, I think in your area on your river, this would be a great place to share that with the group, and we can have some dialogue around that.
Here we go. Karita says, have you or are you planning to look at water quality or other metrics plotted next to the graph you shared of actions taken within the corridor?
You mean water, like water quality monitoring? Um,
Yeah,
maybe
Lisa, I was
maybe
just
you
sort of,
could say more.
yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I was just curious about like that graph you shared where the changes in practice. Just wondering if there is any other um river value that you can also plot next to those changes. I'm just curious about any connections or things that you see as changes in the river itself, as that could be potentially connected to the forest management.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think at this point we're still like formulating the strategy for what all the different pieces of data we are that we want to bring in.
Okay.
And like how you would, for example, how you would evaluate success now. Like if you were to look at that section of river now and be like, was this all of these things that took place, like would we say that that this is successful now? I'm not sure that we're at a point where we understand all of that, but that is a great suggestion. And I know that there is a variety of water quality data, both collected by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the Forest Service, and Flathead Rivers Alliance, for example, over time that may show some interesting things.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Lisa. How
Thanks,
much?
everyone.
Okay.